Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So over the last week, you may have seen a lot of headlines about a Chinese company called Evergrande. Evergrande is a huge property developer that's found itself in serious financial trouble, and it's been drawing comparisons to Lehman Brothers, the American company that fell at the start of the global financial crisis in 2008. If the Chinese government lets Evergrande fail, it could be really bad for China's economy and potentially have global ripple effects. The future of Evergrande already has investors spooked. On Monday, financial markets dipped worldwide, including the Toronto Stock Exchange, which saw its worst drop in months. There have also been hundreds of protesters at the company's headquarters, and people have been wondering how Beijing, which has been trying to regulate the country's wild real estate market, plans to handle this.
Evergrande is characteristic of the wider Chinese market, even if it is maybe the worst actor.
The Globe's Asia correspondent, James Griffiths, has been following the story, and he's back on the show today. We're going to talk about how Evergrande got here, how real estate in China has gone from being state-owned to becoming the biggest source of wealth for most families, and whether the Chinese government would ever actually let Evergrande collapse. You're listening to The Decibel. Hi, James. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So this company, Evergrande, I'd never actually heard of it until a few days ago, and I've been seeing it in headlines everywhere since then. So maybe let's start with what this company is for people who've never heard of it. What is Evergrande?
So Evergrande is China's second largest property developer. It owns or controls around 1,300 projects in more than 280 cities. It employs about 200,000 people, and by its own estimation, supports another 3.8 million jobs. So it's this huge property developer which is involved all over the country. And then also it has its fingers in a ton of other industries. It runs a bottled water brand, it sells electric cars, and it also owns half of Guangzhou FC, which is one of the top clubs in the Chinese Super League.
And why are there protesters outside its headquarters in Shenzhen?
So there has been warnings for a number of years that Evergrande was basically taking on way too much debt, that the company was hugely over-leveraged, and that at some point it would not be able to pay that debt, and it wouldn't be able to kind of pay investors who have bought into these various products that they sell. Making that even, more acute was the fact that in the last year or so, Evergrande even encouraged its own employees to buy a bunch of wealth investment products and even to lend the company money with the promise of returns in the coming year. And as this debt crisis has kind of reached its peak this month, and it has become clear that finally they really do not have this money to pay people with, do not have the money to pay creditors, you have a bunch of people who realize that they're not going to get their money, and they are understandably upset, understandably scared, and they've gone outside Evergrande's offices, outside the headquarters in Shenzhen, to protest and to demand their money back.
Right, and these protesters include employees, investors, and homeowners, right?
Yeah. So as well as people that have bought wealth management products that Evergrande was selling, that, people are putting kind of 20, 30,000 Canadian dollars in these products. The employees, like I said, who've been encouraged to lend their own company money. You also have homeowners that have bought properties which are either mid-development or have not even started development yet. And they're, understandably worried that these houses are never going to be built. And, they're going to lose however much money they put down as a deposit or however much money they've sunk into it so far.
And so how did Evergrande end up in this situation? Why is this company in trouble? Why are they in so much debt?
So the reason Evergrande is in the situation now, and the reason there is so much concern about this company, is that because as it was growing from the late 1990s, and it really surfed the housing boom that we saw in the 2000s and into the 2010s, when millions of people moved from the countryside into cities across China. As it did so, and it was building tower blocks and building new developments, it took on a huge amount of debt. And today it's estimated to owe about $300 billion US.
So why are we talking about Evergrande today, and what is the immediate problem that they have on their hands?
So the reason we're talking about Evergrande today is earlier this month, they basically admitted that they might not be able to pay some of that debt. They brought on financial advisors and they had to reveal this because they're a publicly traded company. Mm-hmm. And then on Monday, it was reported that they missed a couple of payments to some domestic creditors. And that's what really spooked investors. That's what got Evergrande into headlines all over the world this week, because as well as these payments that they missed on Monday, there is another payment coming up on Thursday, which is to an overseas creditor, and they need to pay $83.5 million. The real concern is if we're talking about them not being able to pay this $83 million, well, in the next year or so, they are due to pay $37.3 billion. Then, how are we going to get from not being able to pay 80 to 37 billion? It beggars belief that they won't default at some point or undergo a huge restructuring.
Right. And what is the company itself saying about whether or not it's going to be able to make these payments?
So they have been very bullish and said that, they will come out of this dark period, and the company's chairman has basically promised that they will make payments and that they will, things will go back to normal. But, basically no one believes that. The only question is not so much will Evergrande default or not, it's will the Chinese government step in to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that in a second, but the backdrop here is China's crazy real estate market. And can you explain Evergrande to me in that context?
So yeah, for that we need to go back to the late 1990s, which is when the Communist Party reformed the real estate market and made it possible for people to own their own homes. And since then, in China, it's become very, very important to own an apartment, own a house, both kind of culturally. This is often something that people do before they get married. They'll make sure that the prospective groom has got a house before he enters into marriage. So one of the big kind of unique factors about the Chinese market is that there is a huge, huge oversupply in apartments, in homes in general. As of 2019, one of the most recent estimates, there are about 65 million homes sitting empty across China. And some of these are in, what are called ghost cities, these huge developments in the middle of nowhere where people haven't moved to and kind of slightly embarrassing blots on the landscape. But it isn't just there. This is also a major factor in big cities in China. When I lived in Shanghai in 2013, there were parts of the city where you would see apartment blocks that were almost completely dark at night because none of the owners of those apartments lived in them. They were all bought by speculators. They were just sitting there generating money. But one of the reasons that they're empty, one of the reasons that people sit on them is because the rental market in China is nowhere near the level of the housing prices. So returns for landlords are very low. Even in big cities, you're talking only around 2%.
But also, I've read that the Chinese government would be really reluctant to try and bring home prices down because so much people's wealth is tied up in the real estate market. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. But what's very strange is, you would think in a country where there's this huge glut of the market of apartments that it wouldn't necessarily have astronomical house prices because, the law of supply and demand should work out that there should be driving prices down, but that just hasn't happened. We've seen prices go up almost consistently since 1998. And this has put us in a situation where the average Chinese family is taking on a huge amount of debt or is just not able to buy an apartment or a home where they live. They might have to take somewhere, far in the suburbs. It's very, very difficult for families to buy property. In some parts of China, the ratio of house price to income runs as high as 50 times. So that means 50 times your annual income to buy a house, which, is a huge sum for most ordinary people. So the obvious question is kind of why doesn't the government do something to rein this in? Why don't they do something to reduce house prices? But the real fear is because the vast amount of families, all of their wealth is in their home and there is not much return on rental. So you're not making money as a landlord. Your return on this home is selling it with the assumption that it has gone up, X amount in the years since you've owned it. And the fear from the government is, or seems to be, that if they intervene in a way that really drives prices down, either a real estate crash or even just a big correction in the market, then that could lead to a huge amount of anger and potentially social unrest. And, these protests that we saw outside the Evergrande offices, they could be a blip compared to protests you might see if, millions of families across China suddenly decide that their house that they spent all of their family savings on is worthless.
What do you think Evergrande's situation tells us about the state of the real estate market in China?
Yeah, so this is another reason there's been a lot of concern, a lot of focus on Evergrande, because while it's arguably the poster child for indebtedness and being over-leveraged in China, it is not necessarily an outlier when it comes to the Chinese property market. There are a ton of other developers who have a ton of debt and have basically been surfing on cheap credit for years and years and years and have built lots of projects and developments that people don't necessarily want to buy and, are having trouble selling them. Mm-hmm. Evergrande is characteristic of the wider Chinese market, even if it is maybe the worst actor. And one of the reasons that this kind of crisis has come to a head is that the Chinese government has, in recent years, tried to remedy that. They've tried to dampen the market. They've tried to reduce the amount of speculation. Various local governments around the country have introduced things like property taxes to try and drive down house prices. And that policy change from allowing this kind of rampant speculation to really trying to contain it now, that's one of the reasons Evergrande has suddenly found itself in a position where they can't just go to a Chinese state-run bank and say, give us a ton more money. And why Evergrande is so interesting is not just because this one company might go under or might be completely changed in how it operates, but because, this might just be the first in a long list of companies which have to completely reform themselves in order to avoid a similar type of situation.
Okay, so experts and investors are skeptical that Evergrande is going to be able to pay, and they're hoping that the government is going to step in and bail this company out, right? But what happens if the government doesn't step in? What is the worst case scenario, and what kind of impact could it have on China's real estate market?
Yeah, so the worst case scenario is what is being called a Lehman moment. So after Lehman Brothers, the US bank, which went under kind of just before the 2008 financial crisis. And the fear there is that if Evergrande was to suddenly collapse and go bankrupt, that would kind of have knock-on effects within the market. It would drag the entire Chinese housing market down, potentially cause a credit crunch in the country. It would, really have a huge dampener on the Chinese economy, which obviously is a massive driver of the global economy. And that on top of COVID and on top of everything else, could really plunge us into another global recession. That's the absolute worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. It's important to say that most people think, or pretty much everyone thinks, that's not going to happen. Mainly because the Chinese government has an absolute ton of reserves. They, have shown a huge willingness to intervene in markets before. There is no reason to expect that the Chinese government would stand by and watch their economy collapse. As much as they do not want to bail Evergrande out, they're not going to let this, infect the wider real estate market or the wider Chinese economy.
So that Lehman Brothers comparison that you made earlier, is that a fair comparison?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because, yes, in a way, were Evergrande to collapse, I think it's clear that it would have an effect similar to what Lehman Brothers collapse did on the US economy and then on the wider global economy. But Evergrande is not going to be allowed to collapse. The Chinese government, they're trying to reform this sector. The instincts that the government had to try and rein this in, to try and kind of control this speculation, to control companies like Evergrande becoming so indebted, that is something that we're seeing applied all over the economy and all over lots of sectors under Xi Jinping. There has been a kind of real push back towards state control of the economy, away from market-driven approaches. And in a way, the intentions of a lot of it are laudable. It's, to try and reduce the massive amount of inequality in China. They do not want to bail out Evergrande. They do not want to step in and kind of let these executives who have hugely over-leveraged this company, they don't want to kind of step in and let those guys off. But at the same time, they're not going to let this company tank their economy. They're already kind of making signals that Evergrande will have to honor its commitment to build the property that it said it's going to build. So it is similar to Lehman, but also I think what is the most notable difference is not so much the dissimilarities between the companies, but the difference in the two governments that we're talking about. So the difference between the US government, which was very hands-off at the time and wasn't until the crash really kicked in that they started to intervene, and the Chinese government, which will intervene, as soon as things get shaky and probably is already having words behind the scenes.
So ideologically, they're not opposed to intervening, but you also wrote about how the Chinese system has certain advantages in dealing with situations like this because they can force certain things to happen, right? Can you just tell me a bit about that and what kind of powers they have, like, to be able to fix this?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a rule of law country. This is, it's a country where regulators can essentially make new rules on the fly, where the government, if it likes, could simply step in and take the company over. At a kind of less radical level, most of the largest banks in China are state-owned. If the government needs money, needs credit to be put on hand for Evergrande or for whatever results from the restructuring, then there is a lot of money for them to tap. And should they need to, can also act in a very unfree market way, let's say, and, essentially write the rules themselves on how to react.
So earlier, you kind of hinted at the Chinese government's attempts to reform the economy. And last month, Xi Jinping talked about something called common prosperity. So tell me about that and how stepping in and bailing out Evergrande would fit in with that doctrine.
Yeah, so the doctrine of common prosperity is this new idea that's being pushed by Xi Jinping as kind of, driving principle behind a lot of these economic reforms. And at its simplest level, the idea is that this is, reducing inequality and making sure that people, everyone in the country can share in the gains that have been made in the past few decades. And, again, it's a very laudable goal. It's, maybe more in keeping with the principles of the Communist Party than the free market policies that they followed since the 80s. But part of that has been reining in a lot of China's billionaires of, kind of trying to reduce this flashy spending, which we saw a lot in the 2000s. And, that a lot of these kind of billionaires who'd set themselves up as real power brokers outside of the Communist Party system, and they're being reined in. In keeping with that, there will be a definite desire, I think, that whatever happens with Evergrande, that it doesn't look like that the Chinese government is stepping in to help, one of the richest men in the countries, who the chairman of Evergrande, Xu Jiayin, is, that it doesn't look like they're just stepping in to help this rich guy. And, I think we can expect that a lot of people near the top of Evergrande, probably Xu himself and probably other people, will be made to answer for, the sins of Evergrande in the near future, and that whatever happens to the company, they may not come out of this, in the same condition that they went in.
Okay, James, thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to James Griffiths. You can find him on Twitter at @JGriffiths. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globemail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.